Thank you all so much for joining us. As you trickle on in here, we're just gonna give it one quick moment to check out some cool stuff. So first off, here's the book trailer for Edge of the Map.
A lot of people, they look at me and they're like, you're crazy. I would never go up there. It's dangerous. The physical and mental challenge of the sport, of trying to push yourself as far as you can go to achieve the summit.
Considered one of the top female high-altitude mountain climbers in the world, Christine Boskoff has tackled more summits than any woman alive. Her partner, Charlie Fowler, is among the best-known mountaineers in the United States.
They were great partners. And that lifestyle that they were in, your partner is really meaningful.
Summit or die. It's a famous quote from the Japanese, and you might have to.
The last camp before the summit.
Both set out for the treacherous border region between Nepal and southwest China in October. They were last heard from on November 9th.
Rescuers in China's Sichuan province have said that they have located the body of one of two American mountain climbers.
What she had was an incredible love of mountains. Chris, she wanted to touch them. She wanted to be on them. She wanted to be absorbed in them. Needed to be in that environment, like up close and personal, on rocks, on glaciers, around crevasses, everything. Just insatiable desire to be part of those mountains.
The thing that really intrigues me about climbing is not only the venture of the excitement and the danger of climbing, but it's also going into a different land and seeing the people and experiencing their culture.
Charlie was an inspiration to a ton of people.
He was one of the greatest climbers in the world. He's climbed more things, done more first ascents. He was technically just awesome. But he wasn't cocky, he wasn't, his motto was the more the merrier. We would take people climbing with us. It didn't make any difference if you've ever climbed a day in your life.
His stories, if you could get him to start telling stories, they were amazing, and the things he's done in his life.
Chris was the first woman I saw Charlie spend time with that was on par with him in terms of athletics, climbing ability, and just sheer sense of adventure. You don't get that opportunity to be close to exceptional people like that.
But she loved that climbing, From the very top of Mount Everest, from our solar telephone, she called, "Mom, I made it and I'm on top of the world." And that's where she was, and she was so happy.
She wanted to pick up mountain madness from Scott Fischer, who had died during the 1996 Everest disaster, and run it as a business that could be profitable enough in order to help her in getting out and climbing all over the world. She was successful in that. She'd climbed a number of the big 8,000 meter peaks. That should have given her great brand recognition, but she was a very, very humble person.
Chris and Charlie were always looking for something new. Once Chris chose to no longer pursue the big 8,000 meter peaks, I think her focus changed to going sort of after the uncharted climbs. Technically, the climbing is harder, so it's just a different game, and I think it's more true to the spirit of climbing.
We were expecting Chris back on December the 7th, but the plane arrived and she didn't.
And Damon called me and said, Charlie and Chris didn't make the flight. And that's kind of when we sort of went into action.
We weren't exactly sure where they were.
Nobody knew. Nobody knew, and it was a real hunt.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for, I hope you enjoyed that wonderful trailer from the folks at Mountaineer Books. And we are absolutely delighted that you have joined us this evening. Sorry, I'm trying to get that to stop playing. We are absolutely delighted to be here live with journalist Johanna Garton to hear more about her biography of the esteemed mountaineer Christine Boskoff. We are also so excited to be here to welcome adventurer Vanessa O'Brien, who has a book coming out in March of 2021. I'm your host, Jessica, the event coordinator here at Country Bookshelf, and we're grateful to be joined in this virtual space by our fellow Books in Common Northwest stores, Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Be sure to visit booksincommonnw.com for more information and follow us on Eventbrite to register for more great Books in Common events. Before we get to Joanna and Vanessa, we wanted to point out a few things about the virtual space. We are recording this event, and it will be viewable on booksincommonnw.com, as well as the Books in Common NW YouTube channel after the event concludes. There is a link to buy your copy of both authors' books in the chat, and it should reappear periodically here once I get it clicked over. Just click the logo on the logo of your favorite sponsoring store to fill up your cart with all 8 million copies of Edge of the Map. And don't forget to pre-order Vanessa's book. If you have any questions for either or both of our speakers tonight, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as time allows. You can also see the questions that folks have asked and upvote questions you think are particularly interesting. You are also welcome to leave comments in the chat room. Those are being monitored so we can share them with the group. And if you leave a question there, we'll try to get to it as well. If you run into any technical issues along the way, we recommend you first try exiting and re-entering the webinar. If you can't get back in, we hope you'll visit the Books in Common NW YouTube channel to watch live there. We also recommend trying headphones to fix any sound quality issues. We would like to remind you that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for everyone, and ask that you be respectful of those who have joined us tonight. Offensive or inappropriate comments will see the user dismissed from this space. So now, our speakers this evening. Joanna Garton is a mother, proud Wisconsin girl, writer, and cross-country coach. Before the publication of her first book, she dabbled in nonprofit consulting, college teaching, and had a brief but quickly extinguished career as a lawyer. She's moved her family to China, been charged by an elephant, run 20+ marathons, and is addicted to sweaty 6 a.m. yoga classes. Among the things she's trying to do better are reading roadmaps, keeping the family dog out of the garbage. If you have tips, let me know. Baking the perfect apple pie, and being on time for anything, anywhere. She and her husband share their home in Denver with 2 bright children who are much wiser than she is and the inspiration for all her storytelling. Vanessa O'Brien is a Guinness World Record holder as the first woman to reach the Earth's highest and lowest points, and also for climbing the 7 summits in 295 days. She has climbed 5 8,000ers, including 2 back-to-back, 8 days apart, and became the first American and British woman, as a result of her dual nationality, to successfully summit K2 in 2017. Her book, To the Greatest Heights, will be published in March of 2021 by Simon & Schuster. You can pre-order that. So don't forget to add that to your cart this evening. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joanna. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you for having us this evening. I'm super excited. This is the very first time that I've done a presentation with Vanessa, who's become a dear friend of mine through the writing and research of Edge of the Map. So I'm super excited to have her with me. I am going to start out with about a 25 minute slide deck with just kind of an introduction to the book. You've already gotten a little bit of that, but I'll do a little bit more with pictures. And once I'm done, I'll bring Vanessa in, and I've got a few questions for her. So we'll chat for another 5 minutes or so. And then we're happy to open it up to your questions. So as Jessica mentioned, feel free to type those in and we can take those at the very end. So let's see here. I'm gonna share my screen. Great, okay. So again, thank you for having me tonight. I am gonna talk mostly about Edge of the Map. I've got one picture, I think, coming up about my very first book. Edge of the Map is actually my second book. My first book is called Awakening East, and it was published in 2015. And it was about the adoption of my two children from China and our subsequent move to China, where we lived for a really wacky year. So I have been working on books full time for about 6 or 7 years now. And prior to that, as you heard, I had a number of different careers, as so often happens in this day and age. I'm trained as a journalist and as a lawyer. I've worked in nonprofits for many years. I taught here in Denver. I'm located in Denver at Regis University, which is just up the road from where I live. Taught there for about 10 years, and now I am writing full time. So this is a lovely place to start, and I really do. I love this picture. I think probably many of you are familiar with it. It's an image that was taken last year in May by a Nepalese mountaineer his name is Nims Persia, and he was attempting to summit Everest. This was in, yes, I think it was May 2019, I believe. And it shows just this crazy queue of climbers on the way to the summit. And I always like to include it when I start my presentations to sort of illustrate where my journey with Edge of the Map started. And it was because, like so many of you, I have always been really fascinated with mountain stories. I am not a climber and I'm not a mountaineer. I live in Colorado, so I do get into the mountains quite a bit, but I wouldn't consider myself a hardcore mountaineer. But for my entire life, I have been very drawn to stories that take place in the mountains. And I have always wanted to understand the mentality of climbers, the risks and the drama, the losses, the grief, and the exhilarating highs. Obviously, all of that has been super fascinating to me my whole life, as it is for many of you, I'm sure. And so after the publication of Awakening East, I began to look for a second project. And I had 3 projects in mind. I had kind of a fluffy piece of, I guess, what you would call chick lit in mind. The second idea I had was a really deep dive into China's one-child policy, which was, at the time I was considering this project, it was just sort of unraveling. And then there was a story that my mother, who is also a writer, had been working on. And this was the story of Christine Boskoff. And Mom had been working on this story for about 10 years, but she slowly needed to pull back and began to realize that she would not be able to finish the story because of the advancement of Parkinson's disease, which she'd been living with for a few years. So at that time, I offered to help her, and I'll share a little bit more at the end of the presentation about how she got involved with Christine's story. But let me just tell you how I picked which of these 3 stories to focus on. So I brought all 3 stories to this incredible writing group that I have here in Denver. It's 6 women, brilliant and talented. We all write kind of different things. And I described all 3 projects. And I held Christine's story for my 3rd description. So they sort of listened to my first 2 descriptions. And then as soon as I described the story of Christine Boskoff and what my mom had sort of pulled together so far, the whole room lit up, and it was obvious that this was going to be the next book that I was going to write. So off I went, and, you know, as so often happens with things that you eventually become really passionate about, I had no clue how deep I was going to dive into this world. But Chris's story was incredibly compelling. And obviously I'd heard bits and pieces of it as my mom had worked on the book over these many years. And sort of the headline from Chris's professional mountaineering career was that she was the only American woman to have summited 6 of the world's 8,000 meter peaks. And this was a record she set in the year 2000, which still stands today, 20 years later, which is quite remarkable. Vanessa and I think one other woman, I think Charlotte Fox also summited 5 8,000 meter peaks. Vanessa can confirm that for me, but Chris was the only one to have summited 6. So she had gone from a successful career as an aerospace engineer into the sport of mountaineering in her mid-20s. And she and her husband, Keith, who was about 17 years older than her, had bought Mountain Madness from the estate of Scott Fischer. Mountain Madness is an adventure travel company. and they had bought Mountain Madness from the estate of Scott Fischer, who was one of the guides who died on Everest in 1996. And a lot of us remember that tragedy through the lens of John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air. And I think this next picture is Into Thin Air, which I'm sure many of you have read. If you haven't, it's a kind of a classic mountaineering book. So Chris went on to have just an absolutely breathtaking rise in the sport of mountaineering. And given that she was a woman, her accomplishments were even more notable, as it's a sport that was and still is really dominated by men, a little less so now, but at the time, definitely dominated by men. But she never saw her gender as what defined her. And that, in my mind, was really what made her story so captivating and so inspiring. It was more about who she was and how she approached this passion in her life with such great humility, which I found very rare in that sport, that really made the story one that I felt needed to be told. So there are many twists and turns in the narrative, and I don't want to give you too many spoilers because it is a page turner. But what is not a spoiler is that in 2006, Chris perished in an avalanche in Western China with her climbing partner and her boyfriend, Charlie Fowler. So this is a picture of Chris and Charlie. This is actually the last picture of the two of them. The two had gone to explore remote parts of Sichuan province, and when they didn't return on their flight home, a search and rescue operation was launched. Now, at the time, both Chris and Charlie lived near Telluride. They lived in Norwood, Colorado. And so the search involved this incredibly complex, coordinated effort between friends in Telluride and Norwood and the Seattle offices of Mountain Madness, as well as officials in China. So it was extremely complicated, full of mystery. Obviously, all sorts of cultural dynamics were at play, very frantic, obviously, and very emotional. And on top of all of this, this was happening right before Christmas in the year 2006. So very intense period. So as this process began for me, the first place I went was research. And I pored over my mom's research and I began reading every book that I could put my hands on that fell into the category of what I call mountain literature or mountaineering literature. And some of these books were better than others. Most all of them were written by men. Most of them were memoirs. And I read book after book after book until they sort of started to sound the same. And then at that point, I began to realize that what I wanted to write really didn't exist. And what I wanted as a non-mountaineer was something that could teach me a little bit about the sport, but that also had humanity and that had depth. And so by this point, I had access to Chris's journals, and I'd begun to talk to her friends and family members. And I knew that I wanted to capture her spirit because she was just a wonderful person who was just incredibly full of life. And so I wanted to capture her spirit, but I wasn't really interested in writing just a biography. I was also really fascinated, as I mentioned, by the details around climbing and the science around training for big expeditions, the complexities of running large-scale expeditions. I wanted something that could teach readers and inspire them, but also move them and captivate them. And basically, I was wanting to read, or I was wanting to write a book that I would want to read myself. And so this was a real turning point for me when I realized that what I wanted to write really didn't exist, and certainly not with a female alpinist at the center of the story. So I especially love that Vanessa is here tonight because at the time I started Edge of the Map, I didn't feel there was anything that really spoke to that in that genre. And now I'm very happy to say there's not one book, but there's about to be a second book like that with the release of Vanessa's book. So very exciting. So here's another picture of Chris. I really love this one as well. So this process for me, the process of research and writing, quickly got bigger than I imagined. I interviewed probably 75 people and I read obviously everything I could get my hands on. I traveled to Seattle several times and Telluride several times. And then eventually I did travel to China to retrace the steps that Chris and Charlie took, their last steps. And what was really fascinating about this process for me as a writer, which I think you pick up and is happening now for readers, is that I was constantly falling down what I describe as rabbit holes as a writer. There was so much of this sport that was so juicy and intriguing, which, ultimately is why we read these books so voraciously. The lifestyle and the personalities, the large scale expeditions and the Sherpa support staff, the environmental impact of mountaineering. I got off I took a month of my research, just like researching the environmental impact, the spirituality and ethics of climbing sacred peaks, of which Genyon, the last mountain that Chris and Charlie climbed, was one and still is one, obviously. I was very interested in understanding how trauma and loss affects people in the world of climbing. And then obviously the role of women in leadership positions in sports dominated by men. So there were all of these different things to include. And I definitely wanted to include all of that. And so ultimately, I think I wrote a story that has a little bit of all of that, but really weaves together stories and is very grounded in the narrative of this humble woman and her passion to climb. So just a few quick intros about other people that you will meet in the story. This is Christine's husband, Keith Boskoff. He was the one who got her hooked on the sport. He introduced her to the sport when she was working at Lockheed Martin in her mid to late 20s down in Atlanta. And the two of them bought Mountain Madness, which she would later go on to own and run all by herself. And then I think I've got a couple of pictures of Scott. This is Scott Fischer. He was the owner of Mountain Madness, and he and Chris actually met just one time, and it was the year 1995, the year before he died on Everest. And so I actually was able to recreate that interaction in the book, though I needed quite a bit of help. And so part of the challenge with writing the book was that so many of the main players had died. And so because I was adamant that the book was not going to be historical fiction, but instead was going to be creative nonfiction, in those scenes that I wanted to include with no living people to speak to, I had to rely heavily on other sources to kind of make sure those scenes were authentic. And then I would write the scenes, and then I would run those scenes past people who had been there sort of on the edge, who had kind of heard about those conversations, just to make sure that those were really authentic. And it was a crazy, arduous process, but I felt like it made the book more believable to know that the author had done such extensive research. And then we've got another picture of Scott Fischer. This is actually shortly before his death on Everest. And then I think we've got a couple of pictures of Charlie Fowler. Yes, this is Charlie Fowler in the mid 80s, and he was Chris's climbing partner at the end of her life, climbing partner and romantic partner, obviously, as well. And this is a kind of a young Charlie Fowler picture. And then this was Charlie sort of at the end of his life. Really iconic rock climber based in Telluride. Another person you'll meet in the book is a woman named Jane Courage, and she was Chris's best friend. She happily is still with us. She lives out in Seattle, and she has become a good friend of mine as well. She was really instrumental in helping me understand the ins and outs of Chris's personalities and told me tons of funny stories, which I was able to include. And it was just great to have another woman in the story, to be honest, because I kind of got to the point after 6, 8, 10 months of research and constant calls with people. And I realized like 90% of the people I was talking to, or maybe even 95% of the people I was talking to, were men. So I was very happy to eventually connect with Vanessa and talk with Jane to sort of weave in more women into the story. This is Chris's lead Sherpa. His name was Killy Sherpa. He also is happily still with us. He still lives in Kathmandu, and he ran the Nepal operations of Mountain Madness when Chris and Keith bought Mountain Madness in the late 90s. And he is a wonderful soul and has also become a good friend of mine and was really instrumental in helping me understand a lot of Chris's personality, especially in those early years of running Mountain Madness. Now, this is actually a picture that I took. This is Genyon Valley, the site of Chris and Charlie's last trip, which is just an astonishingly beautiful valley with these really lovely jagged peaks. It reminds me a lot of the Tetons, actually. Beautiful rushing rivers, and the base of the mountain has this gorgeous Tibetan Buddhist monastery. The monastery sits at about 16,000 feet. So obviously the monastery and the surrounding area have very few inhabitants. And I was lucky enough to travel there because I really wanted to have the experience of being there to write those final chapters of the book in a more authentic way. And it was truly magical. I think more than anything, more than the beauty in and of itself, being in this very wild place really helped me kind of put things in perspective, and it really helped me understand what it was that drove Chris and Charlie to climb and seek such unexplored places. So here is one more. This is actually a picture of me at the monastery with some of the monks. Again, this is the monastery that sits at the base of that mountain that Chris and Charlie had climbed. So the monks were also incredibly helpful to me because some of them actually remembered Chris and Charlie, and I was able to talk to them about the power of the mountains and what they remembered about those moments with Chris and Charlie. You know, when I say I talked to them, that was a little bit tricky. I do speak a little bit of Chinese, so that was helpful. But sometimes I would run into monks in the monastery who only spoke Tibetan, and I don't speak any Tibetan, and I had a translator with me, and he didn't as either. He didn't speak any Tibetan. So we kind of bumbled and had these funny conversations that were really entirely pantomiming and writing pictures, drawing pictures and whatnot. So talking is maybe a bit of a stretch, but it was wonderful to engage with them and get what little I could from them about those memories they had of Chris and Charlie. So I think I'll probably end in just a minute, but I wanted to get back to the start of the journey and maybe a word or two about something I took away from the process. And then I'm actually going to bring Vanessa in because it's so valuable to have her here, because I think she's able to answer some of the mountaineering questions that I, as an author, might not be able to explain or answer quite as well. And I've actually got a few questions with her myself before we take audience questions. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my mom and mention something that I talked about at the beginning, which was that this is a project my mom had started many years ago. And the backstory about how it landed in her lap and then eventually in my lap is something that I think is kind of worth noting. I don't actually talk about this a lot, but when I do these presentations, I think it's worth noting. So Chris and I were both raised in Appleton, Wisconsin, and it's a city in Northeast Wisconsin, kind of between Green Bay and Milwaukee. And it's as far away from the greater Himalayan range as you can possibly be. And Chris was 3 years older than me. We actually went to the same high school and we lived just a couple of miles apart, but we never, ever met. We just ran in different circles and we did our own thing. And we were just kind of regular girls in high school and off we went. So we both graduated and we left Appleton. And eventually both of us ended up in Colorado. Chris with Charlie near Telluride, and I ended up in Denver. And as I said, I wasn't a climber, so I kind of wasn't in that world. And that's one reason I didn't know who Chris was. But the bigger and more compelling reason is that she was just so humble. She was so humble. She had summited more 8,000 meter peaks than any other American woman, which had made her the counterpart to Ed Viesturs, whose name is obviously well known in mountaineering circles, but obviously beyond mountaineering circles as well. But she was so very under the radar that even being from the same small hometown, I didn't know her. So it wasn't until 2006, when Chris and Charlie went missing, that there was this very small article in their hometown paper. And my mom saw it and asked if she remembered her, if I remembered her, if I knew who she was, and I didn't. And she was intrigued and began looking into Chris's story. And once she understood the depth of Chris's accomplishments, she was convinced that this was a story that needed to be told. And so at that point, she reached out to Chris's mom, who lived, again, just a few miles away. And the women forged this really lovely friendship over many years that Mom worked on the book. And that friendship was eventually passed on to me, along with all of these boxes of my mother's research and the hopes that one day the story would be told. So I love ending it there. And I also think it's notable to mention how I started all of this, which was as a regular person captivated by mountain stories and holding on to that question of why do mountaineers and climbers do this and what drives them? And so I'd love to bring Vanessa in because I've talked a little bit about all of these things with her, and I have a few questions for her that I think she'll be great as we kind of move forward into our Q&A section. So let me bring her in. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. I'm good. Good to see you. Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
I'm doing okay. Yes, I have 3 questions with you before we start our audience Q&A. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So Vanessa and I have talked a fair amount about this, but I want to ask her out loud and have her sort of explain this to you. So one of the parts of Chris's story that I think is resonating so well with so many readers is that she was just seemingly this regular person, what I call a regular person. There was no magic in her life that allowed her to pursue mountains the way she did. And so you have a very similar trajectory in your career. You kind of started on this career path and came to mountaineering later in life. And so I kind of want you to describe that, like what that's been like being a regular person and how that has played out in your life in mountaineering and kind of what we can learn from that.
Okay, perfect. So first, I'd like to thank Jessica for inviting me here to join you. And I just want to say how much I enjoyed Edge of the Map because I have my copy here. And for those that didn't catch my cover quote, I said equal parts climbing history, love story, and riveting mystery. And the reason I said that is because when I was reading it, it was really filling in a lot of the background and detail that I didn't know about at the time. So while it was storytelling, it was also providing, interesting details. So it really was all of those things for me. And I came upon Christine's name when I was debating and researching whether to climb K2. And it started for me around 2014, and I was doing a little Google search, and I put in, kind of K2 and American women, had there been any to climb, this, horrific mountain, where for every 4 that climb, 1 dies. And there it was, the 2002 Mountain Madness K2 expedition. Big press release, all these big write-up, all this stuff. And I was, captivated. 2002. And I thought, okay, well, there it is. It's all there, and I'm reading, but so typical of press. It left me, wondering what happened, ... the big announcement, but, nothing following up what happened. So can't find anything else, Googling, nothing about did it succeed, nothing about whether it failed. So I'm going through the K2 list, 2002. Okay, a year of no summits. That explains it. So I'm thinking to myself, what if Christine had gone in 2003, right? Then she would be the first American woman to summit. So I flipped the page and I looked at 2003, a year of no summits. Now, this is just K2 since 1986, when Wanda became the first woman to climb K2, there is a 40% chance of any 1 year having no summits. So the first thing I thought of was, good on Christine for not spending 2 consecutive years, like I did, having back-to-back no summits. So that was the first thing I thought. But as I read more and more about her, especially finding that she had led Nazir Sabir, the first Pakistan man, to the summit of Everest, I thought there was something poetic in that it should have been her, right? So that was sort of what struck my mind. So when you say regular people, the other thing that comes to my mind is that I think all mountaineers are really regular people, except if you are talking about, say, indigenous people or people who live at high altitude or Sherpas or somebody like that. all mountaineers are regular people. They are completely different as night is as of day, but they really are regular people. I think maybe they have three things in common, and I'm really going off the top of my head, but one would be their preference to seek out high risk or high rewards. I prefer to talk rewards, but people think about risk, so high risk or high rewards, so they're willing to go for that. The second is their tolerance for being in miserable conditions for a longer period of time. I'm not sure all people would want to do that, so that they have a willingness, let's put it that way, a willingness to stay in some pretty miserable conditions. That's not for everybody. And probably the third is ability to go into a state of flow or a high level of concentration and focus. So I'd say they all do that. As far as other things, their age, sex, how they got into climbing, what they're good at, what they have to work at, their religion, height, weight, wealth, nationality, sexual preference, religion, all those things are all over the shop, right? They're all totally different. Mm-hmm. Christine and I are similar in many respects. We both grew up in very cold states, Wisconsin for her, Michigan for me. We both had religion in our lives, or faith, at least, Lutheran for her and Catholic for me. We both had brothers. She had three older brothers, and I had one younger brother, so our placement in the family was different. She was probably a baby boomer. Let me call her a baby boomer. She was 10 years older than me. I might have come at the tail end of the baby boomers and into Gen X, so I was subjected more to the 80s music and one-hit wonders. So, but we both chose to work for industrial companies, so GE for me and Lockheed for her. And so she was really an engineer, and I also in manufacturing and finance industrial. So we were, I'll call left brain people. And that matters when we come into climbing, because we approach climbing very factual and non-emotive. So she comes into climbing, as you mentioned in your presentation, after seeing a presentation on Aconcagua that Keith Boskoff was doing, I think at the time. And I come into climbing really at the beginning of the subprime mortgage crisis, when I'm in Hong Kong, unemployed, looking at the tall buildings, probably inspired, and looking for something to do. So, but neither of us would have been really put off by something like Everest. Everest would have been the attitude and approach to it would have been something that we would have just kind of backed into in a logical way. Does that make sense? We wouldn't have, we would have seen the path to mountaineering as a simple one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good that you mentioned that whole left brain piece, because I think that's an often overlooked component that a lot of mountaineers share. People focus so much on the athleticism, but that particular piece is so beneficial, I found.
Yeah, it's definitely there.
Yeah. Okay, another question. You and I have talked a lot about kind of this push-pull in her story and how much I've wanted to downplay her gender, given that she wanted to downplay her gender. But in the same breath, her gender was the reason that she was so often noted and written about and talked to. So how do you balance that part of your journey, being a woman in worlds that are oftentimes full of men?
Ooh, gender. Okay. All right. Let me answer this in a couple of different ways, but also be specific or clear. Gender does not matter in mountaineering. There's my clarity statement. However, There are differences physically and psychologically between men and women. Hopefully, I am not the first person to bring this to your attention. If I am, I'm very sorry. So, if you go on a high altitude expedition today, women are probably 20-25% of the makeup of that expedition. That's pretty normal today on any 8,000 meter peak anywhere, Nepal, Pakistan, Tibet.
And that's probably more than it was when she was climbing. Would you say maybe a little more?
A little bit more, sure.
Okay.
So, and I try to think, why are those numbers so small? But a lot of it really probably stems historically, because mountaineering historically was really a male pursuit. And I think historically it stems probably in one of two ways. It was either a wealthy male pursuit, or it stemmed from sort of a military endeavor. And you see this sort of at the turn of the, let's say the 19th century, let's say the mid 1800s, when, well, you see it a lot in the Great Game, where the British are against Russia and fighting over the heart of Asia. And they send out the military men who become, in fact, the first mountaineers to map unmapped areas. And they are very often the ones who these mountains are named after. Sir George Everest, okay. Thomas Montgomery happens to name K1 and K2, right? So that's K for Karakoram. And these men are out there mapping unmapped areas because, it's basically a land grab, right? But they are in fact military. And you find your surveyor generals and all this stuff as well. But if you think about it, before I was even born, every 8,000 meter peak had already been climbed. And I think that's interesting because I like to look at that. If you fast forward 100 years from the 1850s to the 1950s, you have Sir John Hunt, Brigadier John Hunt, now on the top of Everest. So in the short period of time, the 12, if you get rid of the outliers, 12 of the 14 8,000ers were climbed in 7 years by 8 nationalities. To me, that's the original World Cup, the World Cup for countries to prove their superiority against each other outside of war. So it's a big wow. And UK takes 2, US takes 1, not the one you think they will, because they fought for K2. They went in the US went in 1938, they went in 1939, they went in 1954, if you can imagine. 1954, they're on their way climbing K2 the 3rd time, and they hear it's actually Everest has just been climbed by the British. So imagine the pressure these guys are under. If the Brits just got Everest, the Americans better get that second highest. But who dies? Art Gilkey. So, right? There's so much pressure. But in those days, there used to be a situation where it's 1 permit per year. So they went and got the 1955 permit, but the Italians snuck in there in 54, the rest is history. But military, Ardito Desio ran it like a military campaign. So fast forward, women, where are we? So outside of early women, and I know some people will say, oh yeah, but yes, they were wives of husbands who climbed. And yes, there's the outlier, who climbed also. But modern women, as we know it, climbed in the 70s. And Junko Taibei is a great example because she climbed Everest in 1975 and all the 7 summits in 1992. 1992, so recent, right?
It is recent.
Now, think about this. 1992, so women are starting to climb, other women will follow, but what do they need? What do women need to climb? They need money, disposable income. So let's just think for a second. Let's say in the 60s, they're burning their bra. Let's say in the 70s that they stopped being typists and they go working 9 to 5. Suddenly they have disposable income. With disposable income, they have choices. With choices, they can now become and do and see what they want to do.
Players, all of a sudden.
Enter our 20 to 25%. And there we have
Interesting.
Our new group.
Yeah.
So I like to say, that they are equal. Chris and I, being in industrial companies primarily made up of men, would not notice on the expedition that they are primarily men, because they're men at work, they're men on the expeditions. But you pose a harder question: does it matter? And it only matters when it comes to things like sponsorship dollars. Because when it comes to a commercial proposition, it's important that women are recognized and seen as good as men in these expeditions. And I think if Chris had lived, she would agree that that's when you have to step up and lend a voice and say, wait a minute, women are successful too. That's the only time. That's the only time you really have to step up and say, wait a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think she lived long enough to be able to fight those battles. I would like to think she would have. I hope she would have.
Yeah. That's the only time it really matters. Otherwise, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. It's the great equalizer, this particular sport. Yeah. This and race car driving, right? Aren't there, like, we've talked about this. I think there are like 2 or 3 that they always say totally equal.
It's I think a square horseback riding, or a square
equestrian. Yeah.
Sailing. There's very, very few things that where men and women are very different. Race car driving, something.
So one of the questions I get most often, which I've touched on a little bit in the presentation, that people are always asking me this question, and it's about the mentality of climbing and what drives people to climb and how do they balance the risks. And I always find that it's a conversation that we can have like 100 different directions, and there are 100 different answers that you can have. So how do you approach questions about that from individuals who approach you and say, well, why do you do this? And it's so dangerous. And I mean, I kind of know what I sort of have learned from this journey, but I'd like to hear your feedback on that.
Okay, so what drives one to climb? I think it's so the best I have found is really from research myself, because that's the best way to really articulate it. And the best person I have found that articulated it the best was a psychologist at Duke University named Dan Ariely. And he's a social psychologist. He works on reward systems. So reward systems are very simple. It says what motivates and drives human behavior. Okay, I go to work because I get paid. Being paid means something to me, therefore I work. Simple stuff. So he looks at mountaineering and he says, okay, so people go to mountaineering either because they get paid or because they go and they have fun. Right? Wrong. He says, wait a minute, if you read books on mountaineering, they're filled with misery. All these books on mountaineering, really, really tall, high mountains, they're filled with frostbite and cold weather and, hard conditions. And, people are miserable. There's nobody having fun. So he's suddenly perplexed at the reward system of the mountaineer. He says, surely somebody would go to the top and they would come down and say, I've made a terrible mistake. This
doesn't happen.
This I will never do again. Because that's the human nature and human behavior response. And he says, instead, they wait a little bit and they go again. So in the human behavior model, the mountaineer breaks the traditional model. And so he says, there's something wrong. It means that the mountaineer is not driven by the traditional reward model of just money. They're driven by something higher, a higher purpose. They're driven by a higher reward system. It's more like, wanting to reach the top, life's peak, It's about fighting, a bigger battle and, fighting the challenge. So there's something more to it for the mountaineer. It's not simple. And so it really was fascinating, research. But there's something very simple in there. And what's simple in there is a very simple statement that says, what you have to work for, you value. And almost the more you work for it, the more you value it. So that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, people have known about this for a long time. Advertising agencies, product development companies, the likes. If you go back to Betty Crocker and those little cake mixes that you see in the grocery shelves, they used to put the eggs in there, they used to put the flour in there, and you just added water, and sales tanked. And then all of a sudden, they took all that stuff and took the eggs and took the flour and said, no, we're gonna take care of it so that you have to put them in. So you have to do more work. And then sales went up because they found that if you took the cake home and you had to add the eggs and add the flour, people were doing more work. And they valued it more. Welcome IKEA. How much work do you do when you buy IKEA and you drive 50 miles to go to develop and put together all that furniture?
But it's so satisfying when you finally finish, right?
Well, if you finally finish, right?
Yeah.
So people have known about this. And so the meaningful work of a mountaineer is being in the outdoors, being in control of your own destiny, doing fulfilling and meaningful work to you, and being in control, and also in control of your own, I'll use this word, futility, not fertility, futility. And that's important because futility, you never know whether you're going to summit or not. So how much effort you're going to put into that summit is down to you. And I think of futility as like the story of, what's the Greek mythology? Sisyphus, where he has to roll the boulder up, and every day it gets to the summit and it rolls down, and he's the punishment for Zeus. That's futility. You're in charge of that, how much effort you will put in. But at the end of the day, it's not the risk that attracts the climber to the mountain, it's the reward. And the reward is almost like a equals parentheses, right? A summation of, let's say, the challenge, the payment, if there is a payment, ownership, identity, the pride, everything that goes into this all makes up everything that it gives you back.
Right. The reward isn't just the summit, it's every step to get there and all of the twists and turns it takes.
Everything that you learn, the journey, and how you can work backwards into this, by the way, if you're ever unsure. And this is, of course, definitive, is if you ever look at a climber's epitaph, you will never see, herein lies a person who wasted their life, right?
Never.
An epitaph on a climber will always be like, herein lies somebody who died doing what they love.
Isn't that true? Yes, it is so simple.
Truth.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh, thank you. Jessica, I know we have a few more minutes for questions if we've had any come in or if you had people email you along the way.
I was just I've done a reminder or two in the chat, but again, if those of you joining us, if you have a question for Joanna or Vanessa, you can drop it in the chat. I've got a couple that were emailed in earlier, so I can share some of those. Maybe the first one for you, Joanna. You're not a climber yourself. Did you find yourself at a disadvantage as you began researching this? Or was that sort of the key to your friendship with Vanessa?
Yes. So that's really interesting. When I started this process, I definitely thought I was going to be at a disadvantage because I was not a climber. And I was a little self-conscious about that as I went into all these discussions, but I ended up feeling like it was a huge advantage because I had so much to learn that I ended up being just a much better listener. I really wanted to understand the intricacies of the sport, and all of the things Vanessa has been talking about were so intriguing to me that I was really zoned in. I didn't have preconceived notions about most things that other climbers might have coming to this project. So it ended up being, I think, thumbs up from that regard.
Good. Do you climb now? Like, is there a little bug in there that's like, hey, let's get to the top of something?
That's funny. So people ask me that a lot, and I say that I'm actually about 100 times less interested now than before I started. Sorry, Vanessa. It's true. It's true. I think because I've just learned so much, and I've learned that it's not my passion, and that it's okay to go off and have my passion be yoga or marathoning or whatever else it might be. I can appreciate the mountains, and I do appreciate the mountains so much more and have a much more respect for them than I did before. But in terms of climbing Everest, I am not interested, but I have a deep respect for those people who do.
Wonderful. Well, Vanessa, speaking of a respect for and love of those mountain spaces, the spirituality of the mountains and the ethics of pursuing sacred peaks is something that's touched on in the book, and a consideration for many mountaineers. How does this play into your climbing choices, and how do you juggle those issues when other mountaineers are at completely other ends of the spectrum?
So, there's always spirituality around a mountain. And, I think a lot of this ties into Tibetan Buddhism on whether the mountain is a god or the god lives at the top of the mountain. And it's often hard to definitively find out which of those is true. And it might depend on the place, and it might depend on the mountain. But either way, every mountain is a spiritual place. So, one thing we always do is before we approach the mountain is have a puja ceremony. And the purpose of the puja ceremony really is, it's on an auspicious day, which is, given to us by a lama. And we put all of the climbing equipment on an altar that we build with local stones. And we're really just asking for permission to climb, forgiveness for any damage that the crampons or ice axes do, and for safe return. So it's, it's really, a simple ceremony, but also a sacred and spiritual one to ask the mountain gods for those things. I remember once looking at a sacred mountain that locals in Bhutan had not allowed to be climbed. It was at one time the highest unclimbed mountain. And the way I looked at it was this. Let's say you get to the top and you have a wonderful flourishing crop for the farmers that year. Well, that's just great. But let's say you get to the top and the crops are filled with locusts and, just are damaged and, it's all ruined. The problem with those two scenarios is that I can't control the crops. So what I'm effectively doing, climbing an unclimbed spiritual mountain, is gambling. I'm gambling with the ritual and the ceremony of the belief system of the local people. Because if I climb and it's successful and they attribute that climb to my success and it's wrong one way or it's right one way, either way, superstition or not, it has nothing to do with me. But it is gambling, and it's a flip of a coin. And if I can't control it, and in this case, I really can't control it, it is gambling. So that was my view. And until I could control it in their favor, I didn't feel it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Do you have other aspects of that you incorporate into your adventures when you are not on a sacred identified mountain, or on, like, would you use the same kind of ceremony if you were climbing Devil's Tower in Wyoming or something like that? How does that cultural shift impact your approach?
So there's talismans. So I know there's a chapter in my book that has there's talismans around my neck, and I joke during one chapter. It's quite a funny book because you have to have a sense of humor in situations like this. But I joke, I wonder which one of these kind of said, "Hey, I got that," right? Because, it could have been St. Christopher stepping up there. "Hey, mate, I got this one." It could have been somebody else. But you wonder, like, with all the talismans that are given to you, or that are that you're superstitious about, if they mean something. And I know, like, on my third, it took me 3 times to get up K2, and I had so many people praying for me of every nationality that far be it from me to do a religious cartoon. I know where that leads in foreign countries. But when people came to me and they said, no, I prayed to Allah, and I prayed to Buddha, and I prayed to to Jesus, and I imagine, like, all these poor guys getting confused, like, oh my God, another one for Vanessa O'Brien, another one for Vanessa O'Brien, another one for Vanessa O'Brien. Like, who the hell is this girl? You know what I mean? And I could just see, this hilarious, like, confusion, upstairs, like, what the hell? But it was great in a way, because when I went to the people, and all I could say is that I know you did, because at the summit, the skies opened and it was a bluebird day. So it was heard, and things shifted. So I think the most important part is really just to have, the faith and the hope, and the mentality and the outlook, because that's what's always going to keep you going and taking one more step. The minute you give up, psychologically, back to the differences between men and women, the minute you give up psychologically is the minute you're out. So if there's something around your neck that helps with that, if there's something in your head that helps with that, if it's, belief system, if it's just, just good karma, that helps too.
Well, speaking of that sort of cultural exchange, in Christine, we learned some about Christine's experience with her lead Sherpa. Is that Keely Sherpa? Am I saying that correctly? What has been your experience, and what do you want people to take away with regards to the Sherpa community?
That's probably more a Vanessa question, I'm thinking, than a Joanna question, because you've had so much experience with Sherpa, Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, look, Sherpa, Sherpa are from the beginning of time, and actually more beginning of time than people even realized. People think, I mentioned Art Gilkey, but the first Sherpa to die on K2 were in the 1939 American expedition. There were 3 Sherpa that perished in that expedition. Sherpa have been helping climbers from the very, 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 very beginning on every expedition. Make no mistake, they were there. They were there with the British. They were there with Sir Edmund Hillary. He did not summit himself. Sherpa have been partners with climbers from the beginning of time. They're partners with climbers today. I think the difference today, if I could say this, at least in my own life, in the old days, I look at climbers, and I'll take Sir Chris Bonington, because, Chris and Doug, they'd go out and they'd go and climb, and they'd form their team, and, they'd just go. and that's great. But none of my mates climb. So if I want to go out for 8 weeks, right? And let's say I even had a job, and wanted to take time off to go out and climb for 8 weeks. My best person to climb with is actually a Sherpa. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is they're available when you're available. So like a dive buddy, unless you're a soloist. I mean, no one loved Uli Steck more than me, but those are unique individuals. So Sherpa are perfect partners, like a dive buddy. They're free when you're free. Second, unless you're like, 6'5", I'm 5'4", they're my height. They're my build. We're perfect. We're perfect gait, perfect stride, perfect pace, perfect everything. So in today's way of climbing, they're the perfect partners. So I really can't say enough about them, except people misunderstand it and they say, oh, but you climbed with a Sherpa. It's like, no. This is not, I would not climb with a Sherpa. That's my climbing buddy. That's who I'm paired with. That's who I climb with. This isn't like I'm hiring a Sherpa and they've got it all wrong. This is like, that's who I climb with. So I just think it's a different formula today. Mm-hmm. Because even the second and third expeditions on K2, I wasn't part of a big group. I just carved off because I knew I needed to take more risk, more reward. But however you do it, I think Sherpas are today, but I will say this, and I don't want to elaborate on this too much because I'll dig a bigger hole. But like there are millennials in Western culture, there are millennials in Sherpa culture. Mm-hmm. So, and the first Sherpa I ever climbed with on Shishapangma, I could never climb faster than Kami, but I could climb faster than his son. And that's not for lack of climbing faster, it's the mentality of the older Sherpa who would simply see somebody climb faster and move faster. The younger Sherpa doesn't understand the dynamics the way the previous generations did, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because they'd have to be about 50, 55 years old to really have been where their fathers climbed, and they inherited that sort of what to look for, the frostbite, the white nose, how people are acting, if they're stumbling, if they're moving a little slow. Now people just look out for themselves. Mm-hmm. They carry their own drugs. They look out for themselves. It's much more of a, I don't know. But, it's just, the millennial Sherpa are just, they're not, they're just not brought up in an old style of climbing. They're brought up in a they listen to rap music. They're on Facebook all the time. It's fine. It's all good. It's different. It's different.
Well, Joanna, what's next? What's your next mountain?
What is my next mountain? Well, it's been an interesting journey this past 6 months. The book released on April 1st. So right when we were all sort of getting locked down. And so it's been a bit of a heartbreak. So I am really happy to just stay where I am and get this story out into the universe, at least through the end of the year. I'm talking to tons of book clubs, which has been great. I'm actually doing a lot of Zoom presentations with book clubs when they're done reading the book, which is fabulous because a lot of times book clubs don't get a chance to talk to authors. And then I'm on the hunt for another story. I loved doing outdoor adventure journalism, so I'm hoping that there's another story out there waiting to be told. And I'm hoping maybe Edge of the Map will be coming to your local screen, film, or TV series. Yes, yes. Crossing fingers. So stay tuned for that. It would make a great movie or series. So give it to everybody you know in the film industry.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us again. If you don't have your copy of Edge of the Map yet, just visit the link in the chat window, click on the logo of your favorite sponsoring store, and one will wing its way to you. And don't forget to pre-order Vanessa's book at the same time. We have more great Books in Common events coming up next week, so be sure to follow us on, follow our website, booksincommonnw.com, or follow us on Eventbrite so you can register for everything en masse, because there's always something new coming down the pipeline. Thank you both so much for joining us and for sharing us with these stories, and we'll bid you all good night.